Welcome, dear listener, to a very different kind of book than we usually explore together. This one isn't the work of a single author walking us through a single argument. It's something more like a garden, carefully gathered one bloom at a time, from hundreds of different minds across hundreds of years, all reaching toward a very same question. What is happiness? And where do we actually find it? The book is called A Book of Happiness and was compiled in 1912 by a woman named Jennie Day Haines. Haines then set out to argue a thesis of her own. Instead, she gathered together the wisest, warmest, most memorable things that poets, philosophers, preachers, and everyday observers had said about happiness across the centuries. From ancient voices like Epictetus and Seneca, right up to her own contemporaries like Orison Swett Marden and Henry Van Dyke. She opens her little book by reminding us of an old and rather amusing fact, that 2,000 years ago, a Roman scholar named Varro apparently cataloged no fewer than 288 different opinions on what happiness actually is. Haines isn't trying to add a 289th theory to the pile. She simply wants to hand us a bouquet of the loveliest thoughts already spoken, in the hope that they might do for us what they did for her. So let's wander through this garden together, section by section, the way she laid it out for us. She opens with a playful old recipe for a happy life, written around 1500 by Margaret Navarre, who imagines happiness almost like a dish to be cooked, calling for generous portions of patience, of inner peace, of a clear conscience, of pleasant memory and hope, all mixed with a little wine of genuine pleasure, and just a few careful drops of love, since too much of that particular ingredient, she warns with a wink, can bring on a flame that only tears will put out. From there, Haines moves into what she simply calls the Our Happiness. Here she gathers voices insisting that happiness is never some grand, distant treasure, but something built moment by moment out of ordinary kindness. Orison Swett Marden, whose books we spent time with before, reminds us here that cultivating the Our Happiness means learning to draw real pleasure from the plainest, most common experiences of an ordinary day. Frederick William Robertson makes a similar point, observing that even the humblest among us can shed something like heaven around themselves through nothing grander than kind words and small acts of watchfulness against wounding others. There's a lovely little poem here by Priscilla Leonard, picturing each day as a basket we fill, one small good thing at a time, careful to let no fret or worry sneak in among the treasures. This section closes with a rather sobering reminder from an old Arabian ruler, a caliph named Abdalahan, who, after 50 years of power, wealth, and victory, looked back honestly over his entire reign and could count only 14 days of what he called pure and genuine happiness. It's a striking counterweight to everything that came before it, a reminder that power and comfort on their own guarantee nothing at all. Haines follows this with a lively little curiosity, an old 18th century piece comparing happiness to a card game, complete with a mock set of rules for playing what the author calls the royal game of happiness. Play your hand with steadiness. It advises, don't betray your own ignorance, and above all, remember that good humor matters more at this particular game than mere cleverness ever could. From here, Haines turns to what she calls the blessing of health, gathering together a whole chorus of older voices, insisting that no amount of wealth or achievement means very much at all without a sound body to enjoy it in. Ben Jonson calls health the one blessing that both rich and poor equally need and equally treasure. John Locke offers his own famous formula here, that a sound mind and a sound body is about as complete a description of happiness in this world as anyone could ask for. There's a wry little verse tucked in here, too, describing a man who spent his health chasing wealth, only to spend that same wealth later in life, desperately trying to buy his health back again. Next comes a section Haines calls The Quest of Happiness. And here the collected wisdom takes an interesting turn. Nathaniel Hawthorne offers a famous warning that happiness, chased directly as a goal in itself, tends to lead us on a wild goose chase we never quite catch. Yet if we simply pursue some other worthy purpose instead, we very often find that happiness is quietly caught up with us, almost without our noticing. Eliphalet Knott puts it just as simply, comparing happiness to a shy nymph who slips away from anyone who chases her too eagerly, but who comes gladly to those who simply go on quietly about their duty. Martin appears again here too, insisting that the only real way to happiness is by obeying the deeper laws of truth and justice we were built along in the first place, since we simply cannot reach real happiness by working against our own true nature. Now, before we continue further into this garden of collected wisdom, let's pause here for a moment. If wandering through these old, carefully gathered thoughts on happiness is giving you something worth carrying into your own day, consider subscribing to the channel so these kind of journeys keep finding their way to you. Now let's continue on. The next section Haines gathers is what she calls a happiness makers. And here the focus shifts outward toward the quiet, everyday kindness we extend to others. Henry Ward Beecher opens this section with a warm blessing on what he calls a happiness makers themselves, those who smooth the friction out of daily life and make the ordinary intercourse of people gentler. Ralph Waldo Emerson offers the lovely thought that nothing beautifies a person's face or manner quite so much as the simple wish to scatter joy rather than pain around them. And Martin reminds us here, once again, that it's the small things, little kindnesses, pleasant words, small unselfish courtesies, that actually make up the real substance of happiness, far more than any grand or dramatic gesture ever could. This naturally flows into a short section Haines simply calls doing good, gathering together voices like John Wesley's famous charge to do all the good you possibly can, by every means you can, in every way you can, for as long as ever you can. Charles Lamb offers a gentler, more private version of the same idea, confessing that the greatest pleasure he knows is doing a good deed quietly, almost by stealth, and then having it discovered entirely by accident. Haines then turns to something lighter, a section she calls the oil of mirth, gathering together a whole delightful chorus of voices in praise of laughter itself. Henry Ward Beecher calls mirth God's own medicine, insisting that all the grim care and moroseness of daily life ought simply to be scoured away by it, the way rust is scoured away by oil. Oliver Wendell Holmes offers a charming little observation about how even the poor man who knows a genuinely good and generous boy laughs loudest of all when that boy passes by. And there's a wonderfully blunt bit of homespun American wisdom tucked in here from the humorist Josh Billings, who insists that man was simply made to laugh, and that all the morning in the world was something we invented entirely on our own, since it was never part of the original design at all. From laughter, Haines moves us into the warmth of what she calls domestic happiness, gathering together a whole chorus of voices in praise of home and hearth. William Cooper calls domestic happiness the only piece of paradise that managed to survive humanity's fall from grace. Oliver Wendell Holmes offers a lovely little meditation here on the true meaning of home, insisting that four walls and a roof mean nothing at all without someone inside them to love and to be loved by. Charles Dickens reminds us that the ties binding a poor family to their own humble hearth are, in his words, forged of the truest metal there is, bearing the very stamp of heaven itself. And there are pages and pages here in praise of children too. Mary Howitt reflecting that God sends little ones into the world not merely to continue the race, but specifically to enlarge our hearts and draw out of us all of our kindest and most unselfish sympathies. Haines then turns to a section on what she calls the world of books, gathering voices that treat reading almost as a form of companionship in itself. Henry Ward Beecher calls a good book a garden, an orchard, a whole storehouse of good company rolled into one. Charles Lamb offers a charming little joke here, wondering aloud why we say grace before dinner, but never before opening a truly wonderful book, when a feast of that kind, he suggests, deserves its own blessing every bit as much. From books, Haines moves naturally into a section on the charm of music, gathering together voices from Alexander Pope, who insists that music can charm even the fiercest grief and disarm even fate's severest rage, all the way through to Thomas Carlyle, who calls music an inarticulate, unfathomable kind of speech that carries us right up to the very edge of the infinite and lets us gaze, however briefly, into that vast unknown. This flows into a section she titles A Heart Song, gathering together verses that treat gladness itself almost as a kind of music we carry quietly within us, meant to be sung out into the world around us rather than kept locked away inside. Now Haines turns to what many readers likely treasure most in this whole collection, a long and generous section on the joys of friendship. Ralph Waldo Emerson calls a house that shelters a true friend a genuinely happy house, one that deserves, in his words, to be built almost like a festival bower, just to properly welcome such a guest even for a single day. Samuel Johnson offers his own famous, practical warning here too, that any of us who fail to keep making new friends as life goes on will eventually find ourselves quite alone, and that friendships, like anything else worth having, require what he simply calls constant repair. And there's a particularly moving passage here from Shakespeare's own Midsummer Night's Dream, recalling the deep, inseparable closeness of two childhood friends who grew together in the old image, like two cherries seeming separate yet joined upon a single stem. From friendship, Haines moves into a section she calls the bliss of love, gathering together voices from John Gay, who calls love something more than mere friendship, a bliss stored up specially for alone, all the way through to Alfred Tennyson's justly famous conviction that it is genuinely better to have loved and lost entirely than never to have loved at all. Then comes a beautiful section on what Haines calls the works of nature, gathering voices that find happiness quite simply and directly in the natural world itself. Ralph Waldo Emerson recalls a sparrow's song he once tried to bring indoors in a cage, only to realize sadly that the bird's true music depended entirely on the river and sky he had failed to bring along with it. William Wordsworth offers his own famous invitation here too, urging us to set our books aside occasionally and simply let nature herself become our teacher for an hour instead. Since a single living impulse from the springtime woods, he insists, can teach us more about genuine right and wrong than 100 solemn philosophers ever could. Haines then gathers a section she calls The Secret Happiness, where Newell Dwight Hillis offers a particularly striking observation, that some people simply cannot look at a whole flowering rose bush without hunting until they find the one single blighted leaf hidden somewhere upon it, and that this habitual searching for flaw, far more than any real hardship, is often the true root of most people's unhappiness. Benjamin Franklin adds his own dry, practical wisdom here too, doubting that a little more money or a little more time would actually make most of us any happier at all, even by the smallest margin. Following this comes a section on what Haines calls auspicious hope, gathering together voices from Samuel Johnson, who insists that hope is genuinely necessary in every single condition of life, all the way through to Alexander Pope's famous and often quoted line, that hope springs eternal in the human breast, since we are never quite content simply to be, but are always, in some hopeful corner of ourselves, still looking forward to what we might yet become. Near the close of her collection, Haines gathers a section on what she calls a quiet conscience, insisting that no outward comfort in the world can substitute for quiet, settled peace that comes only from an honest, untroubled heart. Shakespeare's own words open this section, describing the deep and settled peace that comes from truly knowing oneself. Edmund Burke adds that it is far better to endure the frowns and anger of even the greatest people on earth than to carry home with us a single uneasy conscience. And finally, Haines closes her whole collection with reflections on virtue and holiness, gathering voices that insist again and again that genuine and lasting happiness is never really separable from genuine goodness. Alexander Pope offers a section's memorable closing thought, that virtue alone is truly happiness here below, a conviction Haines seems to suggest through her final choices, that echoes quietly underneath every single other voice gathered in this entire book, no matter how differently each one of them chose to say it. And so, dear listener, we come to the end of this remarkable little garden that Jennie Day Haines so patiently gathered together over a century ago. We've wandered together through the simple, ordinary art of daily happiness, through the plain blessing of good health, through the gentle paradox that happiness is best found by not chasing it directly, through countless small kindnesses that quietly make the world warmer, through the pure oxygen of laughter itself, through the deep comfort of home and hearth, through the quiet companionship of good books and good music, through the treasured joys of friendship and love, through the healing presence of the natural world, through hope that never quite stops looking forward, and finally, through that settled, quiet conscience that no wealth or achievement can ever really replace. If there's one single thread tying together these 288 opinions, and then some on what happiness truly is, it's simply this: nearly every single voice gathered here, across every century and every corner of the world, seems to agree on one thing above all else. Happiness was never hiding very far away at all. It was always close by in the kind word, the quiet duty faithfully done, the good book by the fire, the friend at the door, waiting patiently for us to finally notice it. Thank you so much for spending this time with me, and with this lovely little collection Jennie Day Haines so carefully gathered for us. If these voices gave you something worth carrying into your own day, please consider subscribing to the channel, so these kinds of journeys keep finding their way to you. Until next time, may you notice the happiness that's been quietly close by all along, and I will see you in the next one.